In the quiet suburb of Escondido, California, a close-knit family was settling in for another ordinary evening. January 20th, 1998, began like any other day. 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe had spent her evening in the comfort of her home, surrounded by the familiarity of her family. She was a bright and lively girl, known for her curiosity and creativity, a child who brought warmth and laughter to those around her. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets and homes of Escondido, events were unfolding that no one could have anticipated. The Crowe family, nestled in what they believed was the safety of their home, would soon be plunged into a nightmare from which they would never fully awaken. When morning broke on January 21st, Stephanie's parents and grandmother made a discovery that no family should ever have to face. Stephanie's lifeless body was found on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed 8 times. The scene was incomprehensible, a horrifying juxtaposition of a child's innocence against an act of unimaginable violence. As investigators arrived, they faced an unsettling puzzle. There were no clear signs of forced entry. Stephanie's bedroom window was unlocked but undisturbed, its screen intact, and a sliding door in her parents' bedroom had also been left open. Yet, there was no sign of the chaos one might expect from an intruder.
The murder weapon, too, was nowhere to be found, nor was there any trace of bloody clothing.
This was the beginning of a case that would ripple far beyond the walls of the Crowe home, exposing the fragility of trust and the devastating cost of a rush to judgment. What followed was an investigation that would unravel in ways few could have imagined. The focus turned inward, first toward Stephanie's own family, and then outward to a figure whose presence in the neighborhood that night would come to haunt the narrative. The events that transpired in the days, months, and years that followed would leave scars far deeper than the physical evidence left behind. Confessions would be extracted, lives upended, and the very system meant to deliver justice would come under scrutiny. Stephanie Crowe's death was not just a crime, it became a case study in failure, a story of missteps that began in those first hours of investigation and reverberated through years of legal battles, family heartbreak, and unanswered questions. What really happened that night in the Crowe home? How could a family's loss become a catalyst for such catastrophic errors? And, most disturbingly, did the answers ever truly emerge? This is the story of Stephanie Crowe, a child whose name became synonymous with one of the most controversial investigations in recent history. On the morning of January 21, 1998, a quiet and unsettling stillness hung over the Crowe family home in Escondido, California. The previous evening had been like any other, a family dinner, a young girl tucked into bed after finishing her homework and bidding her parents goodnight. 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe was a beloved daughter, a curious and imaginative child who loved to draw and spent her days dreaming of adventure.
Her bright smile and easy laugh were as familiar to her parents as the house they'd called home for year S.
Yet, what should have been a normal morning soon turned into a nightmare that would tear their world apart. Stephanie's parents, Ruth and Rick Crowe, along with her grandmother, discovered the unimaginable. Stephanie's body lay cold and motionless on the floor of her bedroom, her life extinguished far too soon. The air was heavy with disbelief as they looked down at the girl they had loved so deeply. 8 stab wounds, brutal, deliberate, and chillingly precise, marked her small body. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of chaos or forced entry. The bedroom, typically a safe and familiar space for a child, seemed untouched, save for the tragedy that had unfolded within it. Stephanie's parents immediately called the police, but nothing about the scene made sense. No forced entry into the house. No broken windows or signs of disturbance outside. It was as if whoever had taken Stephanie's life had walked in through an unlocked door, leaving little behind to trace their presence. The window in Stephanie's room was unlocked but the screen was intact. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything had been violently altered. A sliding glass door in her parents' bedroom also sat open, but again, there were no signs that someone had entered through it. No fingerprints, no smudges, no signs of hurried movement. The scene offered few clues to guide investigators. There was no murder weapon. No bloody clothes. It was as if the killer had vanished without a trace, leaving only the haunting question: who could have committed such a brutal act, and how did they leave with no evidence? The police were quick to arrive, and the first responders went through the motions of securing the scene. There was confusion in the air, the kind that often follows a shocking crime, the uncertainty of how to proceed. They began the routine of gathering evidence, fingerprints, blood samples, anything that could lead them to a suspect. But the absence of a weapon, the strange lack of any physical evidence at the scene, left investigators with little to go on. Stephanie's body was examined carefully. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. It seemed as though she had been caught off guard. The scene offered no clues, no obvious direction. Whoever had been in the house that night had made a careful exit, leaving no trace of their identity behind.
When interviewing family friends.
You know, when you're called to a crime scene, you expect to see certain things. A broken window, maybe a door left ajar, some sign that someone forced their way in. But not this time. Everything was too normal. Too calm. It just didn't add up. The lack of evidence, no sign of who could have done this, it left everyone stumped, and that's where it all went wrong. Investigator briefing the reporters. We had no clues. No blood-stained clothing. No murder weapon. And there were no signs of anyone breaking into the house. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a puzzle. And with no obvious answers, the pressure was mounting. What we didn't know then was that the search for answers would take us down a road we could never have anticipated. The lack of any clear evidence became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Without a weapon, with so few traces left behind, the investigation felt like a dead end. And when no intruder could be identified, and no clues could be linked to the Crowe family or anyone close to them, suspicion turned inward. For investigators, the next logical step was to look at those who were closest to Stephanie. Could someone in the family, someone she knew and trusted, have committed such an unthinkable act? And yet, for all the questions that filled the room, for all the uncertainty that followed, one thing became painfully clear: Stephanie's death would not be easily explained. As detectives sifted through the crime scene, trying to piece together a story from the smallest of details, one thing loomed large: the haunting question of how someone could murder a child and leave so little behind. What kind of person could enter a home so quietly, kill so ruthlessly, and vanish without a trace? In the weeks that followed, the search for answers would set off a chain of events that would haunt not just the Crowe family, but the justice system itself. The investigation into Stephanie Crowe's death, like the scene in that bedroom, would soon grow more complex, more entangled. What seemed like an open and shut case, an intruder who had slipped in and out unnoticed, was far from that. And with each step further into the investigation, the truth began to reveal itself in ways no one could have predicted. When tragedy strikes a family, there is a moment, sometimes even before the grief sets in, when suspicion can begin to creep in. And on that cold January morning, as the body of 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe lay lifeless in her bedroom, the police began their investigation. They were met with a disturbing lack of evidence, no clear signs of a break-in or a struggle. No weapon, no bloodied clothing, no footprints in the snow or smudged fingerprints to lead them to a killer. All they had was the scene, the image of a child, gone too soon, in the place she was meant to feel safe. And that, alone, would set everything in motion. For the officers standing in the Crowe home that morning, there was one glaring question: who could have done this? The answer didn't come easily. No one in the neighborhood had seen anything unusual. There were no signs of a forced entry, and no neighbors could provide a clue to the identity of the killer. But there was something they could latch onto, something they began to focus on from the moment they walked through that door. Stephanie's brother, Michael Crowe. At just 14 years old, Michael had already experienced the horror of losing his sister. Yet, it didn't take long before investigators turned their attention to him. Michael had been quiet, distant even, in the hours following Stephanie's death. The grief that a child would feel, the confusion, the shock, it was all written on his face. But to the police, it didn't look like grief. It looked like guilt. Police began to question Michael, and their suspicions grew as they watched him. They saw his silence, his avoidance of the other family members, his failure to visibly grieve the way they thought he should. And so, as investigations deepened, the target on Michael's back only grew larger. The first mistake, as it often does in these high-pressure cases, was turning suspicion inward. The police fixated on Michael, a grieving teenage boy who didn't react in the expected way. They didn't see a mourning brother, they saw a suspect. And from that point on, every action he took, every word he spoke, was viewed with suspicion. The next misstep. The interrogations. Michael, still reeling from his sister's death, was escorted from his home and brought to the police station. The investigators, their minds already made up, quickly turned up the pressure. No lawyer. No parents. Just a boy alone in a room with detectives, facing accusation after accusation. They told him they knew he had done it, that the evidence pointed to him, that his parents believed he was guilty. In their minds, the confession was just a matter of time. Hours of interrogation passed. The Reed technique, designed to break down suspects, was employed with ruthless efficiency. The detectives lied to Michael, telling him that they had proof he was involved, that the truth was already known, that his family believed he was the killer. It was a method that's been shown to coerce confessions, especially from vulnerable individuals like a 14-year-old boy. They didn't need Michael to tell them what happened, they needed him to confess. And after hours of pressure, after being told that his family thought he was guilty, Michael broke. But there was no truth in his confession. He wasn't confessing to a crime he had committed, he was confessing to stop the interrogation. The words spilled out of him as he said, "I'm only saying this because it's what you want to hear." In those words, Michael's fate was sealed. He became the prime suspect, and his coerced confession would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Michael's voice from the recorded interrogation. "I'm only saying this because it's what you want to hear." The confusion, the panic, the fear of a child caught in a system that was supposed to protect him, all of it was there, clear as day, yet ignored by the authorities who should have known better. But Michael wasn't the only one in the crosshairs. As the pressure mounted on him, two of his closest friends, Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser, would soon find themselves dragged into this nightmare as well. The web of suspicion that had ensnared Michael would quickly expand, as the detectives, desperate for answers, turned to the young men in Michael's life. But Michael wasn't the only one in the crosshairs. Two of his closest friends would soon find themselves pulled into this nightmare. The interrogation rooms were about to get a lot more crowded. The question now wasn't just who killed Stephanie Crowe, but who else could be blamed. And with each new interrogation, the story would grow darker, more convoluted, until it seemed that no one was safe from suspicion. The hours that followed were a blur for Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser. Their names had been dragged into the case, just as Michael Crowe's had. And now, they found themselves in the same interrogation rooms, under the same oppressive weight of accusation. The police had already settled on a theory: the three teenagers were involved in the murder of Stephanie Crowe. With that assumption in mind, they went to work, using methods designed to break their will, to make them say what the officers needed to hear. The interrogation tactics they used are well known for their ability to extract confessions from vulnerable people, especially teenagers. The Reed technique, a controversial method of interrogation, was employed to its fullest extent. It's designed to create a sense of isolation, to pressure the subject into a confession by suggesting that there is no escape, that their only option is to admit guilt. Joshua and Aaron had no idea what they were walking into. Hours of questioning turned into days of psychological manipulation. The police painted a picture: they were the ones with the evidence, they were the ones who knew what had happened, and the teenagers, caught in the web of their own lies, had no choice but to confess. For Joshua Treadway, it began as an almost casual interrogation. The detectives told him that they had found his knife, the weapon used to murder Stephanie Crowe. They said they had the evidence that would convict him. Then they took it further. They told him they already knew he was guilty, that his friends had confessed. The pressure mounted, and with it, the belief that his only chance of escaping the wrath of the law was to admit his involvement. Joshua didn't just confess once. He confessed twice, under different circumstances. The first confession was to Oceanside detectives, the second to Escondido police. Each time, he was told the same thing, that they had all the evidence, that the case was solved, and that he was involved. Both confessions were eerily similar, almost scripted. And yet, as the case wore on, Joshua's statement began to sound less like a confession, more like something coerced, forced from a teenage boy who didn't know how to make it stop. Aaron Hauser, the other teenager in this tangled web, also faced the same kind of relentless pressure. Aaron was questioned for hours, his every word twisted to suggest guilt. The police didn't care about his denials, they had already made up their minds. They told Aaron that his friends had confessed, that they knew he was involved. The officers pushed him to hypothesize, to provide a narrative that fit their theory. What if he had been there? What if he had been part of the crime, and just didn't remember? Slowly, Aaron was made to believe that his own silence was an admission of guilt. What's chilling about these interrogations is how effective they can be, especially with young minds. Studies have shown that teenagers are far more susceptible to the psychological pressure used during these methods. Their brains are still developing, and the stress of an interrogation can be overwhelming. Under the constant barrage of questions, the lies about evidence, and the manipulative tactics designed to break them, it becomes almost impossible to see a way out. So, they do what they think they have to do. They give in. Both Joshua and Aaron recanted their confessions. They said they were coerced, manipulated, and made to believe they had no choice but to confess. Their recantations were clear. The confessions had been forced, the product of manipulation, not truth. And yet, despite the boys' retractions, the legal system still had to contend with the damage that had already been done. The damage to their reputations, to their families, to their lives. A judge would eventually rule that the confessions could not be used in court. He found that the police had gone too far, crossing a line by coercing the teenagers into making false statements. The Reed technique, while legal, was deemed to have overstepped the bounds of acceptable conduct. The confessions were ruled inadmissible. But by then, the damage was done. The boys had already been publicly labeled as suspects. Their lives, their futures, had been irreversibly altered. The damage to their mental health would never fully heal. Expert commentary. Psychologist, expert on false confessions. False confessions, especially from vulnerable teenagers, are a tragic reality in our criminal justice system. The tactics used in these interrogations, lies about evidence, pressure to conform to a narrative, are designed to wear down a suspect's resolve. Teenagers are particularly vulnerable because their decision-making skills aren't fully developed. They're more likely to be influenced by authority figures, and that can lead to confessions that aren't based on truth but on the desire to escape the overwhelming pressure of the situation. As Michael Crowe, Joshua Treadway, and Aaron Hauser's stories became more entangled with lies and manipulation, the search for the real killer of Stephanie Crowe began to take a backseat. The justice system had a new focus, finding someone, anyone, who could be blamed for this crime. And in their desperation, they'd broken the most basic rule of law, the presumption of innocence. The story that began with the tragic death of a young girl would soon become a story about the consequences of false confessions, one that would ruin lives and undermine justice in ways no one could have predicted. The search for justice took a turn in early 1999, when the weight of the truth finally began to shift the course of this case. For over a year, the spotlight had been fixed firmly on Michael Crowe and his friends, Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser. But what seemed like a closed chapter was far from over. DNA evidence, evidence that had been disregarded in the initial rush to secure convictions, was now under the microscope. A routine test, belated but crucial, linked Stephanie's blood to a piece of clothing that had once been dismissed. It wasn't a piece of clothing belonging to any of the boys in custody. It was Richard Tuitt's shirt. The revelation was earth-shattering. The blood of the victim was on Tuitt's clothes, not on Michael's or his friends. This discovery, years in the making, was enough to shatter the false narrative that had been built around the boys. For the first time, the case began to unravel. The prosecution, embarrassed by the revelation and still reeling from the flaws in their case, did what they could to salvage the situation. They dropped the charges against Michael and his friends, releasing them after more than a year of wrongful detention. But this wasn't the end of the road. Despite the glaring evidence that pointed to Tuitt, the authorities weren't ready to let go of their convictions so easily. They chose to pursue Tuitt, now charging him with manslaughter. Tuitt's trial began in 2004, but even as the prosecution built their case against him, the questions surrounding evidence contamination loomed large. Tuitt's defense team argued that the blood on his shirt could have come from mishandled evidence or a series of careless errors in the investigation. In the face of this uncertainty, Tuitt was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a conviction that would haunt him for years to come. The legal battles didn't end there. Tuitt's defense appealed, and the case was far from settled. The errors in his trial, including restricted cross-examination of key witnesses, would eventually lead to the conviction being overturned on appeal. The legal system, in its attempt to right its wrongs, had been forced to confront the damage done by years of wrongful assumptions and missteps. In 2013, after years of legal battles, a jury acquitted Tuitt, citing insufficient evidence to prove his guilt. After over a decade of trials, appeals, and twists of fate, the truth had finally come to light, but it had come too late to save those who had been wrongly accused. For Tuitt, the road was long, but in the end, it was his conviction that was overturned, leaving the lingering question: had the real killer ever been found? The aftermath of Stephanie Crowe's murder was not confined to the walls of a courtroom. It echoed through the lives of everyone involved, from the Crowe family to the families of the boys who were wrongfully accused, their lives shattered by a justice system that had failed them. The Crowe family, already devastated by the loss of their daughter, was thrust into a nightmare that lasted for years. Michael Crowe, a 14-year-old boy who had lost his sister, found himself ensnared in a web of wrongful accusations, interrogations, and ultimately, a trial that had no basis in truth. It took more than a year before he was released, his name cleared, but the scars of that ordeal would never heal. For the Crowe family, the emotional toll was unimaginable. They not only had to mourn Stephanie but also endure the pain of watching their son be wrongfully accused of her murder. The years that followed were a blur of legal battles, media scrutiny, and a quest for justice that seemed forever out of reach. In the end, the families of Michael, Joshua, and Aaron, the boys who had been unjustly implicated, filed a civil lawsuit against the cities of Escondido and Oceanside, seeking restitution for the damage done to their lives. The case dragged on, but in 2011, a settlement was reached. The families were awarded $7.25 million, but no amount of money could undo the damage done. The real tragedy, though, was the lasting impact on all involved. For the Crowe family, the pain of losing Stephanie was compounded by the years of anguish that followed. For the three boys who had been accused of murder, the scars of wrongful imprisonment and public condemnation would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser, though not convicted, would always carry the weight of that chapter with them. Michael Crowe, despite being exonerated, would never fully escape the shadow of suspicion. This case serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly justice can derail when investigators lose sight of the truth. The true horror of this story is not just the brutal murder of a young girl, but the way the justice system's failures rippled outward, destroying lives and leaving a lasting trail of emotional and psychological damage. The pursuit of justice should have brought clarity, but instead, it brought confusion, false confessions, and irreversible harm.
A legal expert commented.
The system is supposed to protect the innocent. But in this case, it was broken. Families were torn apart. It's a haunting reminder of how justice can be clouded when assumptions outweigh the truth. In the end, the lessons learned from this case are both haunting and clear. The truth must never be buried beneath the weight of preconceived notions, and no one, no family, no individual, should ever have to bear the consequences of a justice system that has lost its way. The case of Stephanie Crowe was never meant to remain unsolved. A young girl's life was taken, and in the wake of that tragedy, the truth should have been clear. But years of missteps, miscalculations, and wrongful accusations clouded the pursuit of justice. Stephanie's family was left with an undeniable, haunting question: who really killed Stephanie Crowe? The authorities' focus on the wrong individuals led to years of emotional and psychological turmoil for those accused. But even after a tangled web of confessions, retractions, and failed trials, the case remains unsolved. The answer that the Crowe family, the boys falsely accused, and the public sought was elusive. Despite charges, trials, and reversals, one fundamental truth remained: Stephanie's killer was never truly brought to justice. The DNA evidence tied to Richard Tuitt raised even more questions than answers, but it wasn't enough to provide closure. And with the 2013 acquittal of Tuitt, it's unclear if the real killer will ever be found. The question remains: could Stephanie's real killer still be out there? This case has laid bare the systemic flaws in the justice system. The rush to judgment, the coercion of confessions, and the blind pursuit of a narrative have done nothing but ruin lives and frustrate the pursuit of truth. Families were torn apart, futures ruined, and justice left incomplete. What does this say about our justice system, when it fails those it's meant to protect, when it casts suspicion on the innocent and ignores the truth? We must ask ourselves, how many more lives will be broken by the flaws in a system that needs reform? As we reflect on this case, it's clear: accountability must be the cornerstone of justice. No family should have to endure the torment of being betrayed by the very system they rely on. No innocent individual should be held in a nightmare of wrongful accusations. And no one, least of all a grieving family, should have to wonder if the true killer is still walking free.